If we accept that our stories can mislead us and that our certainty often exceeds our evidence, we still have to decide whether to take a risk, accept a loss, or whether to hold on to what we have. And when we make those decisions, we tend to assume that we're evaluating in a rational way. But Kahneman argues that we're not. Rather than evaluating outcomes in absolute terms, we evaluate them relative to reference points. And when we experience losses, the feelings are more intense than equivalent gains. He even goes out to say that we often construct preferences in response to how options are framed. His conclusion is that the structure of choice is far more sensitive to context than we usually recognize. But this book, it doesn't stop at risk. It ends by introducing a distinction that is less about probability and more about experience itself. Because what we choose next is often shaped not by what we actually felt, but by what we remember feeling. The deeper thread connecting these ideas is that value isn't fixed and preference isn't stable. Both are constructed just as our judgments were. By the end, the architecture of the mind will look different. It won't just be a system that generates impressions and confidence, but a system that shapes how we evaluate pain, reward, and even the quality of our own lives. The moment you see how choice is structured, it becomes difficult to assume that your preferences are as self-authored as you might have thought. When we think about value, we often assume that it's absolute. If something is worth $100, or if a particular outcome produces a certain level of satisfaction, we imagine that value as fixed or inherent. Kahneman challenges this assumption by showing that our evaluations are almost always relative, anchored not in objective states, but in reference points. A reference point is the baseline against which gains and losses are measured. It may be the current status quo, an expectation, a past outcome, or even an imagined alternative. But what matters isn't the absolute level of wealth, income, or performance, but how the present situation compares to what we have anticipated or became accustomed to. Consider a simple example. Receiving a bonus of $500 may feel gratifying if it exceeds expectations, yet the same amount can feel disappointing if one expected $1,000. The numerical outcome is identical, but the psychological experience differs because the reference points is also different. We don't react to the total amount in isolation. We react to the deviation from what we considered normal or deserved. This relativity extends beyond financial context. A runner who finishes a race in a respectable time may feel satisfied if it surpasses their previous performance, but dissatisfied if it falls short of a personal goal. What makes reference points so influential is that they shift as easily as when expectations adjust. Social comparison alters baselines, and recent experiences redefine what feels normal. Because your mind's fast thinking evaluates outcomes quickly and automatically, it responds to these shifts without announcing them. The emotional reaction emerges first, and only afterwards might your mind's slow thinking articulate a justification. The deeper implication is that gains and losses are not objective categories. They're psychological constructions. A change in framing can move the same outcome from the domain of gains to the domain of losses simply by altering the reference point. What once felt like progress can feel like decline if expectations rise. In the same way, what once felt like deprivation can feel like relief if expectations fall. This relativity prepares the ground for one of Kahneman's most consequential findings, that once outcomes are categorized as gains or losses relative to a reference point, they're not treated symmetrically. Losses exert a different kind of influence than gains, and that asymmetry shapes how we approach risk itself. When outcomes are evaluated relative to a reference point, a further asymmetry becomes apparent. Gains and losses aren't experienced with equal psychological weight. A loss of a given magnitude tends to feel more intense than a gain of the same magnitude feels pleasurable. This imbalance, which Kahneman and Tversky identified repeatedly in their experiments, is what they call loss aversion. At a purely numerical level, gaining $100 and losing $100 are symmetrical events, but psychologically, they aren't. The displeasure associated with losing is typically stronger than the pleasure associated with gaining, which means that individuals often require the possibility of a larger gain to compensate for a potential loss. A fair gamble, one in which the expected value is neutral, but frequently feels unattractive because the prospect of losing carries disproportional emotional weight. What makes this asymmetry so consequential is that it reshapes risk preferences. When people are positioned in the domain of gains, meaning that the outcomes are framed as improvements relative to their reference points, they tend to become more risk averse. Securing a sure gain feels preferable to risking it for a slightly higher payoff. Even when the possibilities make the gamble rationally attractive, the certainty itself provides relief. However, when people are positioned in the domain of losses, meaning that the outcomes are framed as reductions from their reference point, their behavior often reverses. They become more willing to take risks in an attempt to avoid a sure loss, a gamble that offers a chance to eliminate the loss entirely. Even if it carries a substantial probability of worsening the situation, that can feel preferable to accepting a guaranteed decline. This reversal is not driven by inconsistent logic. It reflects the structure of the value function that Kahneman and Tversky proposed. The psychological curve representing gains tends to be concave, indicating diminishing sensitivity as gains increase, while the curve representing losses is steeper and convex, indicating both diminishing sensitivity as a stronger reaction overall. The slope of the curve is sharper on the loss side, which visually captures the idea that losses loom larger than gains. Because these reactions arise quickly and automatically, they're rarely experienced as distortions. Avoiding a sure loss by gambling feels justified because the emotional weight of the loss dominates the calculation. Similarly, securing a modest gain rather than risking it feels prudent because the relief of certainty outweighs the incremental benefit of a larger reward. Loss aversion also helps explain why people cling to possessions they already own, why negotiations can stall over relatively small concessions, and why status quo options often feel safer than change. Once something is incorporated into a reference point, giving it up is experienced as a loss, and that loss carries more weight than an equivalent gain elsewhere. What emerges from this analysis is a picture of decision making that diverges sharply from the classical economic assumption of stable and rational evaluation. Value isn't fixed, and risk preference is not consistent. Both shifts depending on whether outcomes are framed as gains or losses relative to a moving reference point. So when we accept that sensitivity to losses and gains is nonlinear, another feature of our evaluation becomes clear. The intensity of our reaction doesn't increase proportionally as amounts grow larger. Instead, our sensitivity gradually diminishes. Diminishing sensitivity describes how our responses change as the magnitude of those gains and losses increase. The central insight is that psychological impact doesn't grow in direct proportion to objective size. Instead, the difference between small amounts feels larger than the same numerical difference between large amounts. An increase from $100 to $200 feels substantial because it represents a doubling relative to the initial reference point. By contrast, an increase from $1 million to $1,100,000, though objectively far larger, may feel comparatively minor because the proportional change is small. The mind doesn't respond linear to absolute values. It responds to relative differences. The same pattern applies to losses. The difference between losing $100 and losing $200 can feel sharp and immediate, while the difference between losing $10,000 and $11,000 may feel comparatively muted, even though the numerical gap is identical. As amounts move further from the reference point, the psychological curve flattens. Each additional unit carries less emotional weight than the previous one. This curvature is central to prospect theory because it explains why risk preferences shift in structured ways. In the domain of gains, diminishing sensitivity contributes to risk aversion. Once a gain is secured, the incremental pleasure of additional gains decreases. So the certainty of keeping what one has felt more attractive than pursuing a marginal increase through risk. In the domain of losses, the convex shape of the value function helps explain risk-seeking behavior. When facing a sure loss, the incremental pain of additional losses diminishes relative to the hope of escaping the loss entirely, making a gamble psychologically tolerable. What is striking is that this curvature operates beneath conscious calculation. We don't experience ourselves applying a nonlinear function to outcomes. We simply feel that certain changes matter more than others. And those feelings guide our choices. Because the response feels immediate and authentic, it rarely appears distorted. Diminishing sensitivity also reinforces the importance of reference points, since evaluation depends on deviations from a baseline rather than absolute states. And since the impact of deviations decrease as they grow larger, our sense of value is constantly recalibrated. What once felt like a significant gain can become the new normal, reducing the emotional impact of further improvement. What once felt like a severe loss can gradually become integrated into expectation. The broader implication is that our preferences are shaped by how those changes are positioned relative to our current state. Because the psychological curve bends, identical differences can feel dramatically different depending on where they occur. And if the value we assign to outcomes depends so heavily on framing relative to the reference point, then even logically equivalent descriptions of the same situation can produce different choices. The framing effect determines which reference point becomes salient in the first place. What Kahneman demonstrates is that logically equivalent descriptions of the same problem can lead to systematically different choices, not because people misunderstand the information, but because the presentation shifts the psychological domain in which the decision is evaluated. Consider a situation in which individuals must choose between two public health programs. One option guarantees that a certain number of people will be saved, while the other offers a probabilistic chance that more people will be saved, but also carries a probability that none will be saved. When the outcomes are framed in terms of lives saved, most people prefer the sure option. However, when the identical outcomes are described in terms of lives lost, preference reverses, and many people favor the gamble. Nothing about the objective consequences has changed. The numerical structure remains constant. What changes is the framing, which moves the decision from the domain of gains to the domain of losses relative to a reference point. Once the situation is perceived as involving potential losses, the psychological asymmetry introduced by loss aversion alters risk preferences. What makes framing effects particularly revealing is that they expose the instability of preference itself. If preferences were fixed and internally consistent, logically equivalent representations should produce identical choices, yet they don't. Instead, choices shift depending on whether attention is directed towards what is preserved or what is forfeited. This instability doesn't necessarily reflect confusion. Participants in such experiments often understand the equivalence once it's explained. The reversal occurs because the evaluation happens automatically, at the level of intuitive response, before deliberate reasoning reconciles the frames. The emotional reaction to gains and losses is triggered by how the problem is presenting, and that reaction shapes choices. Framing effect. The framing effects also illuminate the constructive nature of preference. Rather than existing as stable values stored somewhere within us, preferences are often assembled in response to the way options are described. The context activates certain reference points, and those reference points determine whether the situation feels like securing a gain or avoiding a loss. In this sense, choice isn't simply the expression of underlying values, it's a product of psychological structure interacting with presentation. The same individual evaluating the same outcomes can legitimately arrive at different decisions, because the internal valuation system has been engaged in different domains. When we combine reference points, loss aversion, diminishing sensitivity, and framing effects, a consistent picture emerges. Our evaluation of risk is relative rather than absolute, asymmetric rather than balanced, and context-dependent rather than fixed. The classical model of rational choice, which assumes stable preferences and linear evaluation, gives way to a psychological model in which value is shaped by perception. Yet Kahneman's final move goes beyond risk and valuation. He suggests that even our assessment of lived experiences itself is structured in a way that departs from what we might expect. Because the way we remember experiences is not identical to the way that we live them, and the self that chooses is not always the self that feels. To understand that distinction, we have to examine the relationship between the experiencing self and the remembering self. Up to this point, we have examined how the mind evaluates gains and losses, how it responds to framing, and how it constructs preferences in situations involving risk. Kahneman's closing distinction shifts the focus from choice to experiencing itself. And in doing so, it complicates a basic assumption that most of us rarely question. The assumption that the self who lives through events is the same self who evaluates them later. The experiencing self is the part of us that exists in the present moment. It registers sensations, emotions, discomfort, pleasure, boredom, and anxiety, all as they unfold in real time. If you sit through a long medical procedure, endure an awkward conversation, or enjoy a quiet evening, it's the experience itself that feels each second as it passes. In principle, this self accumulates utility moment by moment. If an experience is painful for 10 minutes, the experiencing self endures 10 minutes of discomfort. If it's pleasant for an hour, it enjoys 60 minutes of positive sensation. From this perspective, the duration of an experience should matter, because more time spent in a given state means more total experience. Yet the difficulty arises when we try to evaluate these experiences afterwards. When we ask ourselves whether an event was good or bad for all, we don't replay every moment in equal proportion, and we don't compute a sum of all the seconds we lived through. Instead, the memory of the experience is compressed into a narrative summary. The experiencing self lives continuously, but it doesn't keep record. When a moment passes, it's gone. The self that later answers questions about how an event felt is not the one that lived through each second. It's the remembering self, which constructs the experience in retrospect. This distinction matters because it means that our future decisions are often guided not by what we actually experienced, but by how we remember experiencing it. If a vacation contained many quiet hours of contentment but ended in frustration, the frustration may disproportionately shape the memory. The experiencing self is concerned with duration and intensity in real time, but it doesn't decide what to repeat or avoid in the future. That authority belongs to the remembering self, which condenses events into a simplified account that can diverge from the lived reality. Kahneman's point is not merely philosophical. It suggests that the way we evaluate our own well-being and the way we choose future experiences may be influenced by a summary that doesn't faithfully represent the total experience. The structure of memory can override the accumulation of moments. To understand how this comparison occurs, we need to examine the rules that govern remembered experience. Rules that give disproportionate weight to specific moments and largely ignore others. So if the experienced self lives through events moment by moment, the remembering self is the one that tells the story afterwards. It doesn't preserve a continuous record of lived time. Instead, it compresses experience into a narrative summary, which is then stored as memory and later used to guide decisions. This distinction is easy to overlook because we rarely feel the separation. When asked whether an experience was good or bad, we answer confidently as if we were consulting a faithful internal archive. But what we're actually consulting is the reconstruction of a simplified account shaped by a particular moment that stood out rather than by the total duration of feeling. The remembering self is selective. It emphasizes peaks of intensity and it assigns disproportionate importance to how an experience ends and largely neglects how long this experience lasted, which means that the two events with very different durations can be remembered similarly if their most intense moments and endings are comparable. Kahneman illustrates this through experiments involving discomfort. Participants who underwent a painful procedure sometimes reported the overall experience as less unpleasant when the procedure was slightly extended with a period of milder pain at the end. From the perspective of the experiencing self, this extension meant more total discomfort. Yet the remembering self evaluated the experience more favorably because the ending was less severe. What becomes clear is that the remembering self operates according to its own rules. It values narrative coherence and salient moments rather than the cumulative duration. When we later decide whether to repeat an experience, we rely on that remembered summary, not on the total number of seconds spent in pleasure or discomfort. This has significant implications. If the remembering self governs future choices, then our behavior may be shaped by a representation of the past that differs systematically from the lived reality. An example of this would be after vacation that was mostly enjoyable but ended poorly may be remembered as disappointing, or a challenging project that concluded successfully may be remembered as worthwhile despite long stretches of frustration. The tension between two selves is profound. The experiencing self is concerned with how life feels as it unfolds, and the remembering self is concerned with how life is interpreted and recounted, because only one of them determines future decisions. The structure of memory quietly influences what we pursue and what we avoid. Understanding this distinction also prepares us to examine the specific rules by which the remembering self constructs its summaries, rules that further illuminate why duration often matters less than we assume. When the question becomes how that summary is constructed, Kahneman's research suggests that it's not built by averaging every moment or by tallying total duration. Instead, it's disproportionately shaped by two features: the most intense moment of the experience and the way the experience ends. This pattern is known as the peak and rule. The peak refers to the moment of greatest emotional intensity, whether positive or negative. Maybe the height of enjoyment during a celebration or the sharpest discomfort during a medical procedure. The end refers to the final moments before the experience concludes. Together, these 2 points carry far more weight in memory than the total span of time in between. What's striking is that the duration itself plays a surprisingly small role in remembering evaluation. An experience that is moderately unpleasant for a long period but ends gently can be remembered more favorably than a shorter experience that ends abruptly or intensely. From that standpoint of the experiencing self, the longer episode contained far more total discomfort. Yet the remembering self privileges that trajectory and final impression over cumulative exposure. This asymmetry reveals how evaluation diverges from lived reality. The experiencing self endures each second equally, but the remembering self also extracts a summary shaped by emotional spikes and conclusions. Because future choices rely on that summary, we may prefer an experience that was objectively longer and contained more discomfort simply because it ended soft in the memory. The peak and rule also helps explain why rituals and narratives are structured around climactic moments and resolutions. For example, a performance is often judged by its most memorable scene and its conclusion. Another one would be a year that may be remembered for a few defining highs and lows rather than for the steady continuity that occupied most of its days. The mind compresses complexity into salient points. What makes this mechanism especially important is that it operates quietly. When we reflect on an event, we don't consciously think, I'm overweighting the peak and the end. The remembered experience feels complete and authoritative. Taken together with the distinctions between the experiencing and the remembering selves, the peak and rule suggests that our evaluation of life is filtered through structural tendencies that privilege intensity and closure over duration. We don't merely forget the middle, we undervalue it systematically. If the peak and rule explains why certain moments dominate memory, duration explains what is lost in that comparison. When the remembering self evaluates an experience, it gives surprisingly little weight to how long the experience lasted. Instead of integrating each moment into a cumulative total, it relies on a condensed summary shaped primarily by intensity and ending. From the standpoint of the experiencing self, duration is everything. Every additional minute of discomfort is another minute lived. Every additional hour of contentment is another hour felt. Yet when we later evaluate the experience, those extra minutes and hours often fail to meaningfully alter the remembered judgment. This divergent can feel counterintuitive because it challenges the assumption that well-being accumulates over time. If pleasure and pain are lived moment by moment, then longer exposure should matter proportionally. But Kahneman's research suggests that the remembering self doesn't calculate total utility. It constructs a story. When participants undergo two versions of an unpleasant procedure, they often report the longer procedure as less painful overall, even though it contained more total discomfort. The additional minutes don't significantly degrade the remembered evaluation because the summary is dominated by the peak and the end. Duration neglect reveals something broader about how we interpret our lives. Many stretches of experience that occupy most of our time, like steady routines, mild contentment, moderate stress, may leave relatively little imprint on memory. But what stands out are turning points, climactic moments, and conclusions. The remembering self compresses continuity into snapshots. This structural feature has consequences beyond isolated events. If the self that makes future decisions relies on remembered summaries, then our choices may be shaped by representation that don't reflect the totality of lived experiences. We might pursue experiences that end well if they're lengthy and draining, or avoid experiences that were mostly positive but concluded poorly. Kahneman's broader point is not that memory is flawed in a trivial sense, but that evaluation itself is governed by specific psychological rules. Just as we saw that value is relative to reference points and that losses carry disproportional weight, we now see that remembered utility is shaped by selective compression rather than accumulation. By the end of this progression, the structure of the mind appears both consistent and limited. It constructs impressions automatically, generates confidence from coherence, evaluates outcomes relative to shifting baselines, reacts asymmetrically to gains and losses, and compresses lived experiences into summaries that guide future choices. None of these mechanisms are rational in isolation. They're efficient. They allow us to navigate complexity without constant calculation. But together they reveal that preference, value, and even memory are not fixed properties, waiting for consultation. They're products of a system that organizes experience according to rules that feel natural but don't always align with statistical or temporal realities. What remains is not a rejection of human judgment, but a clearer view of its structure. A structure that explains why our choices feel grounded and our memories feel complete, even when both are shaped by forces we rarely notice. When you step back from the individual mechanisms like reference points, loss aversion, diminishing sensitivity, framing effects, the experiencing self, the remembering self, the peak end rule, and duration neglect, what begins to emerge is not a collection of isolated biases, but a consistent architecture. We don't evaluate outcomes in absolute terms. We evaluate them relative to shifting baselines, and we respond more strongly to what we might lose than what we might gain. Another point to be made is we don't possess fixed preferences waiting to be consulted either. We often construct them in response to how options are presented, and we compress them into selective narratives that guide future decisions. What this means is not that choice is arbitrary, nor that value is meaningless. It means that evaluation is structured, follows psychological rules that operate automatically and that feel natural precisely because they're built into the way the mind organizes experience. When facing risk, we're not calculating expected utility in the abstract. We're reacting to gains and losses relative to a reference point that may have shifted without our awareness. The continuity across the entire book becomes clearer here. The same system that constructs coherent stories from limited information also constructs value from relative comparison. In the same way, the mind that mistakes fluency for truth also mistakes emotional weight for importance. The architecture that generates overconfidence is in prediction now shapes how we interpret pleasure, pain, and risk. Kahneman's contribution is the descriptive account of this structure. The mind is predictably structured in ways that diverge from classical models of rationality. Its distortions follow patterns. And when you see that structure, the experience of choice becomes more layered. Preferences feel less fixed, confidence feels less definitive, and memory feels less authoritative because they're constructed. What begins as a distinction between two systems ends as a re-examination of value, certainty, and experience itself. Understanding these processes don't eliminate them, but it clarifies the terrain on which judgment unfolds. What this ultimately offers is not skepticism for its own sake, but perspective, a recognition that feeling certain, feeling satisfied, or feeling risk-averse are not direct reflections of objective reality. These feelings are products of a system that organizes the world in ways that are efficient, coherent, and human. By the time Kahneman reaches the end of Thinking Fast and Slow, the argument no longer feels like a list of biases or decision errors. It feels like reorientation. We began with the idea that much of our thinking happens automatically, that impressions arise before deliberate reasoning begins, and that coherence produces a feeling of truth. What emerges from this progression is not a portrait of a flawed mind, but of a structured one. The same architecture that allows us to navigate complexity efficiently also shapes how we evaluate risk, remember the past, and anticipate the future. Our preferences aren't irrational in a chaotic sense. They're systematically constructed through reference points, asymmetries, framing, and narrative compression. The deeper insight is that the mind doesn't directly register reality as it is. Rather, it organizes reality through internal processes that feel natural because they operate continuously and without friction. Value feels absolute, even though it's relative. Confidence feels earned, even though it may reflect coherence more than evidence. And memory feels complete, even though it's selective. Understanding this offers a clearer awareness of how judgment is formed. Kahneman's work ultimately invites a quieter form of intellectual humility. Not the rejection of reasoning, but the recognition that reasoning unfolds within a system where strength and limits can be studied. Once you see that structure, the experience of certainty changes slightly, in the way that it becomes less absolute, less rigid, and perhaps more measured. The mind will always continue to construct, evaluate, and remember, but understanding the structure beneath those processes changes the way that we relate to them.